courtroom silent, Isabella Santos sat cuffed in her maid uniform. George Harrison rolled in with an old leather briefcase. 2 initials on the clasp, G and H. The courtroom stayed still. Isabella Santos sat in the defendant's chair. 18 years old, handcuffs on her wrists. Still wearing her maid uniform, the door opened. A wheelchair rolled through. An old man, 82 years old. His hands trembled on the armrests, but his eyes burned with something fierce. A leather briefcase rested on his lap. Old brown leather, cracked and faded. On the brass clasp, 2 initials caught the light, G and H. George Harrison, once the sharpest defense attorney in the city. But that was decades ago. Decades since he last stepped into a courtroom. Decades since he last fought for anyone. Everyone thought he had retired. The truth was worse. He had run away. Now he was back. For a girl he barely knew. A maid's daughter. A dead gardener's child. Why? The answer was buried inside that case, along with years of guilt. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. 3 months earlier, Isabella Santos had been a different person. She stood at the gates of the Harrison mansion. 19 acres of perfect gardens, a house with 47 rooms, and a job that paid $8 an hour. The head housekeeper met her at the service entrance, Sylvia Mendez, 40 years old. Dark hair pulled back tight, a fitted black dress, eyes that missed nothing. Sylvia looked at the application form. Her finger stopped on one line. Father, Roberto Santos, deceased. Sylvia's expression changed. Something cold passed through her eyes. Santos, Sylvia repeated softly. Your father worked here, Sylvia said. Isabella nodded. For 30 years, ma'am, Isabella said. I know exactly who he was, Sylvia said. Her smile did not reach her eyes. Follow me, Sylvia added. The kitchen was warm. A heavy woman stood at the stove, Carmen Flores, 55 years old, 25 years in this house. She turned and saw Isabella. Her wooden spoon clattered to the floor. My God, Carmen whispered. You look just like him, Carmen said. That afternoon, Carmen pulled Isabella aside. She spoke in hushed tones. Your father was a good man, sweetheart, Carmen said. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. They said he was a thief, Isabella said. He was no thief, Carmen said firmly. Roberto Santos worked in this garden for 30 years. Everyone loved him, Carmen added. Then one day, jewelry went missing. They found it in his room. Carmen finished. Isabella knew the rest. Her father went to prison. 2 years later, he died there. Illness, they said. She was only a child when it happened. She never knew him, only the stories, only the shame. He didn't take it, Carmen said. I believe you, Isabella said. No, sweetheart, Carmen said. You don't understand, Carmen added. I know he didn't take it, because I saw who put it there, Carmen said. Before she could say more, footsteps approached. Sylvia appeared in the doorway, watching, always watching. Carmen fell silent. That night, Isabella found a small room in the servants' quarters. She unpacked her only treasure, a stack of law books, worn pages, handwritten notes in the margins. She had won admission to law school, a half scholarship. The remaining tuition was $12,000. 2 years of a maid's salary. She read until her eyes burned. She would become a lawyer. She would clear her father's name. But she did not know what was coming. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe now. The Harrison family lived on the 2nd floor. Richard Harrison ran the family business, 52 years old. Kind eyes, a weak spine. His mother controlled everything. Eleanor Harrison, 78 years old. Silver hair, pearls around her neck, ice in her veins. And then there was George, Richard's father, 82 years old, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke. He spent his days in the study, surrounded by books he never opened, staring at a shelf he never touched. One night, George could not sleep. He wheeled himself down the corridor. A light glowed under the study door. He pushed it open. Isabella sat on the floor, law books spread around her. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, a highlighter still in her hand. George looked at the book in her lap. Criminal law, his old textbook, his handwriting in the margins. From long ago, he recognized those notes. He recognized that hunger. George did not wake her. He simply watched and remembered. The next morning, George spoke to Richard. That girl, George said quietly, the new maid. She got into law school, George added. Richard nodded. Carmen mentioned it, Richard said. She has a half scholarship, Richard added. What about the rest? George asked. She can't afford it, Richard said. George was quiet for a long moment. Help her, George said. Richard hesitated. Mother won't like it, Richard said. Eleanor did not like it. She found George in his study that evening. You want to give money to a servant, Eleanor demanded. I want to give her a chance, George said. Her father was a thief, Eleanor said. Her father was my friend, George said. Silence. Eleanor's face hardened. I won't allow it, Eleanor said. It's not your decision, George said. Everything in this house is my decision, Eleanor said. She left without another word. That night, Eleanor summoned Sylvia. The two women spoke behind closed doors. Plans were made. The weeks passed. Isabella worked hard. She cleaned rooms. She served meals. She spoke when spoken to. At night, she studied. George began leaving books outside her door. Legal texts, case studies, always with a small note. Chapter 7 will be useful, one note said. The Henderson case changed everything. Another note said, never give up. A third note said, Isabella did not know who was helping her. She suspected Carmen. She never suspected the old man in the wheelchair. Sylvia watched everything. She reported to Eleanor every night. The girl is getting close to George, Sylvia said. Eleanor's jaw tightened. We need to act, Eleanor said. Sylvia smiled. I have a plan, Sylvia said. One afternoon, Isabella cleaned George's study. She noticed a photograph on the wall. Two young men standing on courthouse steps, one in a suit, one in gardening clothes. Both were smiling. The date on the frame was from the early 1990s. Isabella looked closer. The man in gardening clothes, dark eyes, strong jaw. Her father's face looked back at her. She gasped. You knew him, Isabella whispered. Behind her, a wheelchair creaked. George had been watching from the doorway. Yes, George said softly. I knew him, George added. Then why didn't you help him? Isabella asked. George looked away. His hands gripped the armrests. Because I was a coward, George said. Because I was told to stay silent, George added. Because I made a choice I've regretted every day, George said. Isabella did not know what to say. George wheeled himself to the window. I was supposed to defend him, George said. I had the evidence. I knew he was innocent, George added. What happened? Isabella asked. George's voice dropped. I was told to drop the case, George said. By someone I loved, someone I trusted, George added. I chose my marriage over my friend, George said. Roberto went to prison. I never practiced law again, George finished. He turned to face her. I'm sorry, Isabella, George said. I'm so sorry, George added. But that was not the only secret. That week, Carmen found something. She was cleaning George's desk. An old file folder fell open. Santos, Roberto, case file. Carmen's blood ran cold. She knew that file should have been destroyed. She opened it. Inside, a single document, the original complaint, filed by Eleanor Harrison, a witness statement beneath it, signed by Lucia Mendez. Carmen's hands trembled. Lucia Mendez, Sylvia's mother, everything connected. Eleanor filed the complaint. Lucia planted the evidence. And George had the proof the whole time. But he never used it. That night, Carmen went to George's study. She did not knock. I found the file, Carmen said. George did not look surprised. I wondered when someone would, George said. You knew, Carmen said. All these years. You knew Roberto was innocent, Carmen added. I knew, George said. Then why? Carmen demanded. Because Eleanor is my wife, George said. Because exposing her would destroy everything, George added. Because I was weak, George admitted. Carmen wanted to scream. But George continued. Lucia Mendez planted the jewelry, George said. But Eleanor ordered it, George added. They wanted Roberto gone. He saw something he shouldn't have seen, George said. What did he see? Carmen asked. George was silent. What did Roberto see? Carmen demanded. Eleanor, George said, with Lucia's husband. In the garden house, George added. Roberto saw them. Eleanor couldn't risk him talking. George finished. Carmen sat down heavily. Years of lies. An innocent man dead. A daughter left fatherless. All to protect one woman's secret affair. Sylvia had her own plan. She crept through the house at night, watching, listening, waiting. One evening, she found her moment. Eleanor's diamond necklace, worth $40,000, sitting on the vanity. Sylvia took it. That night, Sylvia slipped into Isabella's room. Isabella was sleeping. Sylvia moved silently. She placed the necklace under Isabella's mattress. Then she disappeared. 3 days later, Eleanor announced the necklace was missing. Sylvia called the police. A search was conducted. The necklace was found in Isabella's room, under her mattress. Isabella stood frozen as they handcuffed her. I didn't take it, Isabella cried. Please, I didn't take anything, Isabella begged. Sylvia shook her head sadly. I'm so sorry, Isabella, Sylvia said. But the evidence is clear, Sylvia added. Isabella looked around desperately. Carmen stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. George watched from his wheelchair, his hand pressed against the window. Isabella was led away. The same house, the same accusation, the same method, father and daughter, years apart. If you need to know what happens next, hit subscribe. George sat alone in his study. The leather briefcase waited on the shelf. Old brown leather, faded, heavy with what he had hidden. Richard came in. Father, Richard said. They're taking her to trial, Richard added. I know, George said. She's innocent, Richard said. I know, George said again. Then do something, Richard demanded. George stared at the shelf. I'm not that man anymore, George said. I haven't been for years, George added. Then who are you? Richard asked. George swallowed. I don't know, George said. A coward, a ghost, a man who let his friend die, George added. Richard knelt beside the wheelchair. Father, Richard said. You can still make this right, Richard added. That night, George did not sleep. In her cell, Isabella sat in darkness. The same walls her father knew, the same cold. A guard approached. Santos, the guard said. Visitor, the guard added. Carmen stood on the other side of the glass. She slid a letter through the slot. Isabella opened it. The handwriting was shaky. Old Isabella, the letter said. I knew your father. He was my friend, it continued. I failed him. I will not fail you, it said. The truth will come out. I promise, it ended. George Harrison, the signature read. The initials are G and H, it added beneath. Isabella's fingers trembled on the page. G and H, George Harrison. She understood now. The books, the notes, the secret helper. It was him all along. Could she trust him? Did she have a choice? George called Carmen to his study. I need you to testify, George said. Carmen nodded. I've waited years for this, Carmen said. It won't be easy, George said. Eleanor will deny everything. Sylvia will lie, George added. I know what I saw, Carmen said. Then and now, Carmen added. George's eyes sharpened. You saw Sylvia, George said. The night the necklace disappeared, George added. I couldn't sleep, Carmen said. I saw her coming out of Isabella's room, Carmen added. She looked satisfied, Carmen said. George nodded slowly. Then we have our case, George said. The courtroom filled slowly. Isabella sat at the defendant's table. Her hands shook. Her public defender looked overwhelmed. The prosecutor smiled confidently. Open and shut case, the prosecutor muttered. Then the doors opened. George Harrison wheeled himself down the aisle. Gasps rippled through the room. Is that George Harrison? Someone whispered. He hasn't practiced in years, someone else said. George stopped at the defense table. Move, George said. The young lawyer did not argue. George positioned himself beside Isabella. I'm your attorney now, George said. You came, Isabella whispered. I made a promise, George said. The judge frowned. Mr. Harrison, the judge said. You have not appeared in this court for decades, the judge added. My bar license is still active, Your Honor, George said. I checked, George added. Very well, the judge said. Proceed, the judge ordered. The prosecutor presented the case. The missing necklace. Found in Isabella's room. Clear evidence of theft. George listened in silence. Then it was his turn. He called his first witness. Carmen Flores. Carmen walked to the stand. Mrs. Flores, George began. How long have you worked for the Harrison family? George asked. 25 years, Carmen said. Did you know Roberto Santos? George asked. Yes, Carmen said. He was a good man. My friend, Carmen added. George nodded. Tell the court what you witnessed, George said. Years ago, George added. Carmen took a deep breath. I saw Lucia Mendez going into Roberto's room late at night, Carmen said. She had something in her hand, Carmen added. The next day, jewelry was missing. They found it in Roberto's room, Carmen finished. The courtroom murmured. And recently? George asked. Carmen looked directly at Sylvia. I saw Sylvia Mendez coming out of Isabella's room late at night, Carmen said. She looked pleased with herself, Carmen added. The next morning, the necklace was reported missing. Carmen finished. Sylvia jumped to her feet. She's lying, Sylvia shouted. Sit down, the judge ordered. George wheeled himself to the evidence table. Your Honor, George said. Years ago, Roberto Santos was convicted in this courthouse, George added. He died in prison, George said. George's voice grew stronger. That man was innocent, George said. I knew it then. I know it now, George added. Because I kept proof, George said. George lifted the leather briefcase. On the clasp, the initials gleamed again. G and H. He opened it. Paper slid into the light like a confession. This is the original case file, George said. The complaint was filed by Eleanor Harrison, George added. The sole witness was Lucia Mendez, George said. The same pattern, George continued. Plant the evidence. Blame the innocent, George said. George pulled out a photograph. Roberto Santos and George Harrison. Young, smiling. This man was my friend, George said. I was supposed to defend him, George added. I had everything I needed to prove his innocence, George said. But I stayed silent, George admitted. He looked at Isabella. Roberto died in prison, George said. His daughter grew up with shame that wasn't hers, George added. Tears rolled down Isabella's face. I carried this guilt for years, George said. I stopped practicing law because I couldn't face what I'd done, George added. But today, I'm done being silent, George said. George turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request the security footage from the Harrison mansion, George said. From the hallway camera on the night of the alleged theft, George added. The footage was retrieved. The courtroom watched. A figure moved through the hallway, Sylvia Mendez, entering Isabella's room, leaving minutes later. The judge turned to Sylvia. Miss Mendez, the judge said. Would you like to explain? The judge asked. Sylvia's face went white, then red. This is a setup, Sylvia screamed. That footage is fake, Sylvia insisted. The footage is from your employer's own system, the judge said calmly. Sylvia turned to Eleanor. Tell them, Sylvia cried. Tell them I was following your orders, Sylvia begged. Eleanor's face was stone. I have no idea what this woman is talking about, Eleanor said. Sylvia's eyes widened. Betrayed, just like her mother. You promised, Sylvia screamed. You promised you would protect me, Sylvia shouted. Just like you promised my mother, Sylvia added. Eleanor said nothing. The judge had heard enough. Based on the evidence presented, all charges against Isabella Santos are dismissed, the judge said. Ms. Mendez will be held for questioning regarding evidence tampering and conspiracy, the judge added. Guards moved towards Sylvia. She did not resist. She simply stared at Eleanor. My mother died for your secrets, Sylvia said quietly. And you don't even remember her name, Sylvia added. She was led away. Isabella stood slowly. The handcuffs were removed. She turned to George. Why? Isabella whispered. You didn't even know me. Why did you do this? Isabella asked. George took her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. Because years ago, I made the wrong choice, George said. I let an innocent man go to prison. I let my friend die, George added. I carried that weight every day, George said. He looked at Isabella. And then you came, George said. Roberto's daughter, studying law books at night, George added. George's mouth softened. You reminded me of who I wanted to be, George said. You gave me a reason to wake up, George added. Isabella was crying now. You were the one leaving the books, Isabella said. The notes, Isabella added. I wanted you to succeed, George said. I wanted you to become the lawyer I should have been, George added. My father, Isabella whispered. Your father forgave me, George said. I know he did, George added. The question is, can you? George asked. Isabella looked at the old man, frail,
broken,
but finally brave. You saved me, Isabella said. You could have stayed silent again, Isabella added. But you didn't, Isabella said. She knelt beside his wheelchair. I forgive you, Isabella said. George's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, George said. Thank you, George repeated. 4 years later, Isabella Santos stood outside the courthouse at sunrise. Not in a Maid uniform, in a tailored suit. A real attorney now. Her shoulders were still small, but her spine was not. In her hand was an old leather briefcase, worn brown leather, cracked at the corners, a brass clasp polished by time. 2 engraved initials caught the morning light. G and H. George Harrison's. George was gone. He passed away the winter after the trial. Quietly, peacefully, Carmen said he finally looked unburdened, like a man who had finished what he came back to do. Isabella never stopped hearing his voice. Not loud, just steady. Never give up. Inside the courthouse, people stared when she walked by. The same hallways, the same cold marble, but this time, she wasn't being led in. This time, she belonged here. A young defendant sat at the defense table, hands shaking, eyes full of fear. Isabella placed the old briefcase beside her chair. She opened her own folder, and she did what George had taught her. She looked the judge in the eye, and she spoke like truth mattered. After the hearing, she walked to the garden behind the Harrison estate. A rosebush bloomed there. Carmen had planted it. A small marker stood beside it. Roberto Santos. Beloved father, the truth waits. Isabella knelt. She set the old leather briefcase on the grass. Just for a moment, she pressed her fingers to the worn handle. I did it, she whispered. I became the lawyer you wanted me to be, she said. The wind moved through the leaves. And for the first time, it didn't feel like grief, it felt like peace. This story was inspired by real events. Names, locations, and certain details have been changed, and events have been dramatized for narrative purposes. How would you rate this story out of 10? Tell us in the comments. We need your support, please. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching. See you soon.